We'll bring them to sanctuary city areas and let that particular area take care of it.
The controversy over immigration. We will take a look at the latest effort by U.S. President Donald Trump and also the White House official behind his immigration policy. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. In his usual style of negotiation, U.S. President Donald Trump is trying to twist the arm of the opposition to work on immigration reform. After forcing the longest government shutdown in history over funding to border security, Trump now says he will consider the idea of releasing illegal immigrants into so-called sanctuary cities, a move meant to punish congressional opponents for inaction on the U.S.-Mexico border.
California certainly is always saying, oh, we want more people. And they want more people in their sanctuary cities. Well, we'll give them more people. We can give them a lot. We can give them an unlimited supply. And let's see if they're so happy.
About a month ago.
According to U.S. media, the president's senior policy advisor, Stephen Miller, played a key role in crafting the plan to release undocumented immigrants into cities governed by the opposition. The U.S. Congress wants Mr. Miller to testify on his policies, but he is shielded by executive privilege. Well, we have a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panel. Right here with me, Eleanor Clift is a political analyst at the Daily Beast and a veteran journalist covering Washington. Also with us, Rafael Bernal is a staff writer at The Hill newspaper. From Mexico City, Laura Carlsen is the director of the Americas program at the Center for International Policy. And Michael Johns is the co-founder of the U.S. National Tea Party movement. He joins us from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Welcome to all of you. Rafael, let me start with you. President Trump says he wants to release illegal immigrants into so-called sanctuary cities. These are cities where undocumented people will be protected from deportation, we think. How does this work? Explain that to us.
Well, that's actually a very fair point that you're making. They would be protected by the local jurisdiction. Not entirely, ICE is still allowed to operate within a sanctuary city. How it would work is, frankly, most serious observers say it wouldn't. You can't, and for starters, the director of ICE at the time when this proposal was made in November and February first said he doesn't know if he could justify the expenditure of putting people on buses in the southern border and taking them to these sanctuary cities. And then, according to the Washington Post, it was supposed to be middle and small sanctuary jurisdictions. So you're taking out LA, New York, Chicago out of the mix. I wonder maybe San Francisco would fall into the mix. It's not a very well thought out plan, but it is a very well thought out political game that the administration is playing.
Right, and Rafael, that was my next question to you. Why is the president adopting this course of action?
So if anybody claims to know the exact answer to this, they are either the president, who knows what he's thinking, or they are lying because nobody else knows what he's thinking.
Right.
It's a course of action. I know many observers said, for instance, if we're going to talk about Stephen Miller, they said this doesn't sound like Stephen Miller because Stephen Miller knows how immigration works. He's worked his whole life to sort of break down the system as it exists, but he understands the system as it exists. And this proposal, frankly, seems to come from somebody who doesn't really understand the intricacies of immigration, or in fact understand that for most places, immigrants tend to be a net benefit.
All right, well, let me try Michael Johns on that question. Michael Johns, why is President Trump adopting this course of action? I mean, is he playing politics here?
I really don't think it might appear to be a political move, but it really ultimately is not, because we have mayors of sanctuary cities throughout this country who have told us for years now that illegal immigrants make their cities stronger and better and wealthier, and that they are welcome. Now, many of us have felt that that's simply political rhetoric, but I think what the president said is that they have said this so repeatedly and so adamantly and with such passion that it's logical to take them up when much of the remaining states in the country and cities that are not sanctuary designations have repeatedly said that they really do not want to be the recipients of them. Now, under the Obama administration, illegals were sent to all areas of this country without any rhyme or reason. This really is in many ways a more sensible policy because we're sending them ostensibly to cities that have said that they welcome them. So it's calling them on that rhetoric, and I think it's incumbent upon those mayors now to sort of say, yes, we were serious about those statements, and we do welcome these illegals, or it was all political gamesmanship, and we were not serious about it. And I think that's essentially what the president's designed. Furthermore, there really isn't an option. Under the catch and release policy, they need to be released ultimately. They can't be detained indefinitely. So it's not a question of whether they should be sent somewhere, but where they are going to be sent.
All right, but Michael, didn't the mayors initially make that offer or create these sanctuary cities because of what was going on in the country, what was going on at the border at that time? Families were being separated, children were being separated from their parents at the time. So these mayors came forward and said, well, look, we're going to create these sanctuary cities where you can't do that anymore.
Well, and also their argument, which I totally disagree with, was that they felt that they would get better cooperation in the event that there were needed to be criminal investigations or other levels of cooperation with authorities in these cities, that they might be reluctant to cooperate if they were there illegally and subject to deportation. That was the argument. Of course, illegals in this country under this, essentially this crisis that we've been confronted, have been engaged in vastly greater levels of crime, and crimes in these cities have elevated as illegals have arrived within them. And they have felt, obviously and probably justifiably, immune from any degree of federal engagement in enforcing our federal immigration laws. And that's the subject, obviously, of a lot of court and ongoing litigation as to what appears to me to be cities' inclination to try to undermine the Article II authorities of the President of the United States, who clearly does have domain over immigration policies, and cities which ultimately do not.
Right, Eleanor, talking about what the president can and cannot do, can he do this? Bring in...
First of all, it's not a plan from the White House. It's more of a threat than a plan. And there are questions about the legality. Sanctuary cities have existed for some time. It's the term sanctuary, which is kind of a new term, and it's not an official term. And it basically applies to cities where the officials are not going to go out of their way to track down people who are there without papers, and where they try to enlist the community to help in crime fighting, and you don't want to alienate people who are there without papers and make them fearful of the police. So the federal authorities still have complete control. They can still have raids and all that, so people are not fully protected at all. But if people are placed in these areas, they will have a network of support. Many of the people who are coming into this country already have family and relatives here, and there are incredible networks of support that exist in New York City and LA and Chicago, all the major cities. And the mayors and even the governor of Washington State, they're saying, you know, we will take our share. They're not, and I think the president thinks that he can send hundreds of thousands of people into any given area, and it will so overwhelm the system, bring it to the breaking point. I don't think that's how it will work, and I think the people around the president, with the exception of Stephen Miller, are probably trying to talk him into some other less extreme policies to deal with the crisis as it exists at the border. I think Democrats recognize there's a crisis, but Democrats' complaint is that the president has helped create and perpetuate a crisis that he could ameliorate with a simple fix in his policies, including, number one, having more immigration judges to adjudicate the cases.
All right, let's go to Mexico City. Let's bring in Laura. Laura, the president has repeatedly blamed Mexico for a lot of the country's immigration problems, for a lot of what goes on at the border. The Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, he has said that he's willing to work with President Trump to resolve these issues at the border. What is Mexico doing right now?
First of all, Mexico has signed on to the Global Pact for Migration, and they're trying to change their immigration policies to deal with what is a humanitarian crisis. We have to recognize that there are new characteristics in what's happening now, and we're seeing it here as the caravans or the exodus from Central America comes up through Mexico. And that is, in these three countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, there's a crisis of crime that has, in part, been caused by historic U.S. policies that's causing people to flee for their lives, literally. A large majority of these people have valid asylum cases. So what we're seeing on the northern border of Mexico, on the United States southern border, is a complete change in the patterns of immigration. We're seeing that over half, 61% of the people coming up are now families, desperate families, children, and their parents. This is the supposed threat to national security that's coming over the border now and that Trump is so adamant about stopping. We're also seeing that these people are not coming over illegally. They're coming over, they're turning themselves in directly to border officials to go through the asylum process. The asylum process was developed for a very specific reason, to protect people who need protection. And that especially applies to children, which is such a large percentage of what we're seeing now. President López Obrador has also said he does not want to fight with Donald Trump. They're looking for solutions to the crisis that's happening now, the humanitarian crisis of Central Americans coming up through the country. They're offering work visas. They're offering the ability to ask for asylum here in Mexico. They're solutions to this problem that are human rights based and that can be dealt with, but not when this kind of rhetoric of treating them as infestations that they're going to dump on cities is continuing.
Okay, as you pointed out, Laura, I mean, there are families arriving at the border, escaping violence in Central American countries. The president has responded by cutting aid to three countries in Central America. That's one thing he's done. The other thing is that he says that families who are coming to the border and claiming asylum on the basis that they're escaping violence, that's just a scam. That's just an excuse to get into the United States.
In order to make that claim, he has to process them because that's what international law says. And the United Nations has done a number of surveys with the people who are coming up through Mexico, and they have indeed found that many of them have valid asylum claims. We're talking about areas where gangs are so powerful, and security forces in some cases as well, are so deadly that people have seen family members murdered in front of their eyes. They've received direct death threats and had to leave with only the shirts on their backs from one day to the next. Their children have received threats if they don't join gangs, and so they've tried to get them out of there. Any family would do the same. Right. These are the situations that we're seeing here, and if we don't go to the root causes, we can't solve the problem.
Right. Rafael, I'm wondering how much of a legal quagmire this is causing for people arriving at the border and seeking asylum. And we do know from previous figures that only 20% of people are actually granted that status.
Yeah,
people applying for it. Now, you're going to have people arriving at the border, asking for asylum, being moved to sanctuary cities. I mean, is this going to be, are people going to be facing a long legal limbo here?
So it's a long process, and it really depends on the case. There are cases that are resolved within weeks, most usually a couple months, something like that. But it can extend for years to fully prove an asylum case, and that's really at the core of the issue here, because of humanitarian regulations and laws. People have to be let go, and what President Trump derides as catch and release, and U.S. law forces the administration to let these people go and sort of live out their asylum case in freedom. And what Trump is saying is, well, then let them live it out in freedom in New York City or San Francisco, which incidentally is what they usually do because they try to join their family members and the communities that already exist here.
No, the irony is the president might actually be facilitating some of these people coming into the country.
Michael, how big is immigration as a presidential election looms 2020? How big an issue is this?
I mean, clearly, if you go back to 2016, when the president emerged over that hugely contentious primary, one of the primary reasons he was successful was that he made immigration and some other issues like trade the pinnacle of his platform. He promised to secure this border. He promised to dedicate himself to ending this crisis. So there was a national mandate, 63 million Americans that supported that effort. And we're pleased to see I think, newfound seriousness within the Republican Party toward border security and immigration. Now in 2020, in essence, I think what is setting up is one party that is committed to border security and sensible immigration policy, and another that has not really defined even the parameters of limitation on the number of illegal immigrants it would allow in this country. It won't, for instance, say what the cap is. What is the cap? You know, I mean, there's no number.
Okay, Michael, just very quickly, I mean, would it be fair to say that a lot of what the president is doing right now is motivated by the fact that he thinks this is a vote getter? This could, get him back into the White House.
I think he has limited options, frankly. I mean, the first option was to have maintained illegal immigrants on the Mexican side of the border. That's been challenged in the courts, including the very liberal Ninth Circuit, where there's been some issues. So now his constraint is where in the U.S. will these people be placed? I mean, they're right now being sent to bus stations and essentially dropped off and left to their own design as far as where they're going to go. That doesn't make much sense either, particularly when you have, as I said, mayors that are saying, yeah, we absolutely want these people in our cities and we believe they make them stronger. Now, I disagree with that. The president disagrees with that. But they are elected representatives of those cities, and if that's their position, they should be afforded the opportunity to prove their sincerity in that offer.
Eleanor, I'm going to go to a name that's been coming up more than once, and you mentioned it earlier on, Stephen Miller, who is an advisor to the president at the White House. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of debate in the media about Stephen Miller and immigration policy. Let's first take a look at a short profile that's been done on him from CNN's Randy Kay.
At 33, he is President Donald Trump's youngest policy advisor, the man at the center of the immigration battle, who seems like he's always ready for a fight.
Jim, that is one of the most outrageous, insulting, ignorant, and foolish things you've ever said.
Stephen Miller embraced his anti-immigrant views early on. After the 9/11 attacks, when he was just 16, he penned an editorial for the Santa Monica Lookout, arguing his high school wasn't patriotic enough. Osama bin Laden would feel very welcome at Santa Monica High School, he wrote. In the same article, Miller complained about rampant political correctness and his classmates who lacked basic English skills. At one point, he tried to stop Spanish language announcements.
I will say and I will do things that no one else in their right mind would say or do.
Miller, now on the world stage, crafted Trump's inaugural speech.
The crime and the gangs and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential.
Miller has a reputation as Trump's enforcer on immigration. He co-authored the president's travel ban, also reportedly helped derail negotiations for the border wall and government shutdown.
This is a very fundamental issue. At stake is the question of whether or not the United States remains a sovereign country.
For his part, the president seems to like what Stephen Miller represents. Not only his conservatism, but his combativeness, too.
So, Eleanor, if we look at Stephen Miller then, what he's saying, he's a relatively young guy, has a very powerful position in the White House, has the ear of the president. How did he get to such an influential place?
Well, he grew up in Hollywood, the son of a well-to-do family, I believe a progressive family in a progressive environment, and he seemed to relish always being the outlier in his formative years. He worked on Capitol Hill in Senator Jeff Sessions' office. He was an Alabama senator before he became President Trump's Attorney General briefly. And he made immigration policy his focus even then. And if you talk to people who worked on Capitol Hill when he was there, they would say if you saw Stephen Miller coming, you would run the other way because you didn't want to get the latest diatribe or rant about immigration policy. So he's a true believer, apparently, in all of these hardline policies, and I think he's gotten the president's ear, and the president's political base seems to be, fearful of immigrants. And I would question what one of the other panelists said about areas of the country saying they don't want more immigrants. I'm not aware of that. You have parts of this country where you have people working in factories and doing very low-level work, and those communities wouldn't be thriving at all if it weren't for an influx of immigrants. So generally, this country has done well welcoming immigrants, and when President Obama was in office, the U.S. Senate passed an immigration reform bill with 68 votes. Now, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives never put it to a vote, in part because of, well, not in part, wholly, because the Tea Party faction on the right would not support it, and the Speaker at the time did not want to pass legislation unless he had a majority of the Republicans, and so it died there. And that was the last sort of fresh look at immigration, and since then it's just been used as a whipping boy on the right, and I agree the Democrats haven't done much to respond. They lack the power at this moment, and I think they would like to revert to that Senate bill that never got a hearing, but it's going to be a very contentious part of the 2020 election.
Right. What's your response to that, Michael Johns? Why did the House vote against that, especially members in the Tea Party?
No, they didn't vote at all. He didn't bring it to a vote.
Right.
Well, and I think when you mentioned that Stephen Miller had, you know, an image of being assertive on Capitol Hill when he worked with Senator Sessions, there was good reason for that, and that is that, you know, for 30 or 40 years, Congress has been completely missing in action on these crucial issues. Go all the way back to the so-called Simpson-Mazzoli Act, which was supposed to have secured our border and didn't. Right. So in essence, I think you've had an individual who has represented the viewpoints of a very, very large percentage of Americans who feel we need a more coherent immigration policy. We need our border secure. Yeah. You don't become a citizen of the U.S. simply because you're more aggressive in trying to get here than others. That's that's not an immigration policy. Okay, Rafael, Congress may have been missing in action, as Stephen points out, but right now, what Stephen Miller is doing has caught the attention of Congress. Let me play this for you first. This is the Democrat Representative Kathleen Rice talking about the possibility of getting Stephen Miller to testify in Congress. Let's watch this.
He is basically the de facto head of the Department of Homeland Security right now, and yet he's unanswerable. I mean, you can't have it both ways. Stephen Miller cannot decide what the policies are going to be at the Department of Homeland Security and then hide behind executive privilege saying, no, 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 I'm just a White House employee.
Does she have a point there?
She does. I mean, he is basically leading DHS. Yeah. And one thing that everybody seems to forget is the reasons that immigration is difficult for Congress today are very different from the reasons 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and 40 years ago. And 20 and 30 being the important ones under Clinton and under Reagan. Stephen Miller has grown up politically alongside this restrictionist movement that was once a complete fringe, and people dismissed people who spoke like Stephen Miller as kooks, essentially. And then around 2003, 2004, first it was Congressman Tom Tancredo started quoting these groups that started in the late 70s that really generate the ideological base for what Stephen Miller has brought to the White House and to the administration. So it's not true that it's really a conservative position, in that this is a position that's never really taken on in the mainstream of either party. There's been anti-immigrant sentiment in both parties, to be sure, but this is a new version that Stephen Miller brought with him, and Stephen Miller has been very good at selling, if not to the entire population of the country, to the one guy who matters the most in designing immigration policy.
So, Rafael, these positions that we hear from Stephen Miller, some may consider them extremist. We have heard some people say they're extremist. But you're saying they became sort of mainstream positions way back in the early 2000s?
Very recent. Well, they started even coming up in Congress in the early 2000s. Yeah. They didn't really become mainstream until Trump brought them mainstream. You can remember in 2012, Mitt Romney said something about self-deportation. Right. That's sort of like a whiff of what the groups that populate Stephen Miller's ideology are saying, but it's a very soft version. This hard, straight version, Trump didn't come up with it, and Stephen Miller didn't come up with it. It's a long story, but an ophthalmologist in Michigan came up with it in the late 70s. It's that sort of esoteric thing. And it is, and I think that the real important point to be made there is that this is new, and it's a bit more similar to what Democrats were saying 30 years ago than what Republicans were saying 30 years ago, but for very different reasons.
Right. Laura, I mean, what's the view from Mexico City? I mean, you've got Stephen Miller, who's, you know, as Rafael just pointed out, running a very important division in the Department of Homeland Security, running immigration there. He's been called a white nationalist in this country. I mean, is he known in Mexico? Are people aware of what this person does?
Yes, and I was waiting for that term to come up because you can't talk about Stephen Miller without talking about white nationalism. Restrictionism has been around for a long time, but this strain of white nationalism, which I disagree with other panelists, I believe that it is a political manipulation, is playing to the worst in U.S. society, playing to racism and playing to xenophobia. People in Mexico recognize that as a threat. Even though Mexico's immigration has gone way down lately and Central American immigration is now the majority, the attitude toward people who are living there, both legal and without papers, has become much more hostile. Communities are being divided, families are more divided, hate crimes have gone up. So there's a tremendous concern here that this strain of anti-immigrant, and not just anti-immigrant, but white nationalist thought that's growing in the United States, and that in large part brought Donald Trump to power, even though he did not win the popular vote, which kind of conditions the mandate that was mentioned before, is threatening not only to U.S. society and to the future, but also to other countries, particularly countries south of the border.
Michael, it's very difficult to pin down exactly when or why Stephen Miller has adopted these very hardline positions. I mean, as Eleanor Clift told us just a moment ago, he came from a progressive family from the West Coast. In fact, his uncle wrote an article for Politico saying that if his nephew's ideas were in place a century ago, his own family would have been wiped out. They came from Europe. And he, the uncle, has called Stephen Miller an immigration hypocrite.
I think let's put this all in perspective. I mean, the President of the United States has the absolute right to appoint his advisors. His advisors are an eclectic group of individuals, many of whom didn't even support him in the primary. He's surrounded by individuals of varying viewpoints, including on immigration policy. Right. Stephen Miller represents the viewpoint that the president ran on in the campaign, which is that the border wall should be built. Overstayed visas need to end. We need to be utilizing a more sensible, rational policy on immigration, and that illegal immigration, both from the standpoint of national security, from the standpoint of our economy, from the standpoint of our public welfare system and public infrastructure, has represented a great threat to the United States of America, and has proven very detrimental. So he's providing counsel on that, but make no mistake, the President of the United States runs our immigration policy, not a mid-level White House advisor. And I think this is part of a political design to try to personalize this legitimate policy discussion.
I want to get something in very quickly here, Michael. Eleanor, very quickly, is it time for the Democrats to come up with a comprehensive plan now?
I think it would be good if they came up with it, because they're actually producing plans on guns, on government reform, on everything, and they need to show what they would do if, in fact, they elected a president in 2020. So, yes, I agree with that.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.